Today we're showing how a basement foundation is built, and we're going to take you through every stage, starting with digging out the hole where the basement will be, drilling the piles for the foundation, covering the site with sand, installing the rebar cages, setting up the formwork, getting stuck with the concrete truck, installing overflow pipes, digging out the trenches, waterproofing the outside, and installing the drainage. All these steps are part of building the basement foundation, and today we're going to cover them step by step. Let's start by digging out the hole for the basement. It might look like a simple step, but everything that follows depends on getting this part right. The depth, the shape, and the position all have to be perfect. And we're not just piling the clay on the sides, we're taking it out completely. To move all that clay, we're using the dump truck. It's getting loaded non-stop because with a basement this size, the piles would build up fast and block the whole site. We're smoothing out the sides of the hole, keeping them straight and clean. That'll make it easier to move around once the foundation work begins. The hole's about a meter wider than the building itself, giving us space to set up the foundations and enough room for drainage later on. This 12-ton excavator fills up a dumper pretty quickly, so as one truck gets loaded, the next one's already pulling in. We're keeping the clay moving non-stop to clear the site fast and keep the digging going without any breaks. Once we get close to the right depth, we check the bottom with a laser. That way, the whole base stays nice and level, which makes the work much easier later on. Before we started digging, we marked out all the basement edges with spray paint. It's the easiest way to stay accurate and make sure we dig exactly where needed. We came back the next day to finish the digging, and the whole hole was flooded with water, but we'll drain it out through the front. That's where the site entrance will be. Once the hole's finished, we're bringing in a thin layer of sand. It keeps us off the wet clay and makes it easier to move around while setting up the axes. We'll add the full sand base later, after the piles are drilled, because that clay coming up would just mix in and make the sand useless. Now we set up the axes. We go around each corner with the optical level, marking the same height on every wooden peg. This height marks the finished foundation level. Then we set the top of each board to match the mark on the pegs and fix it in place with screws. Once it's set, we check the board with a spirit level and do the same on all the axes. And we're left with the same height all around the site. After we set all the strings, we double check the measurements around the entire perimeter. And a few sides needed small adjustments, so we just need to move a nail a bit on top of the board to get the lines perfect. Once all the perimeter measurements are sorted, we can move on to the most crucial step, checking the diagonals. The key point here is to have both diagonals the same length. And now we can start drilling the piles. For this job, we're using a mini excavator. The piles don't need to go very deep, but the ground here is solid clay. It would be a pretty hard mission to do by hand, since even the excavator is fighting through it. The clay sticks to the drill a bit, so after each pile we clean it off with a shovel. We do that every time to make sure the next hole comes out clean and the drill doesn't jam up. Then we double check the pile depth before moving to the next one. We don't need them any deeper than 1 meter. And off we go with the next ones. We're on the last few piles now, and it's time to start mixing concrete to fill them up. 1 bucket of water, 1 bucket of cement, and about 13 shovels of sharp sand. Now let it mix for a bit. Concrete's ready. Time to fill up the track dumper. And off we go to fill up the piles. We fill each pile about halfway with concrete, then drop in the rebar cages. If we filled it all the way first, getting the cages in would be much harder, and putting them in before the pour doesn't help either. It's easier to set them to the right height once there's some concrete already inside. Once the pile's filled, we set the cage up along the string line, and all the piles are installed, ready for the rebar cages for the actual foundations. But before we start installing the rebar cages, we need to make a clean base for the foundations. So we bring in sharp sand for the sub-base, filling up between the piles, not covering the whole site, just where it's needed for now. Once the foundations are in place, we'll backfill the rest of the area. And of course, we compact everything with the plate compactor that locks the sharp sand in place. With everything compacted, we're moving on to installing the foundation rebar cages. First, we cut them to the right size. And yeah, the angle grinder's a bit small for these rebars. Once it's finally cut the size, we can set it in place. We're putting the cages onto rebar spacers welded to the bottom of the piles. That way the cage sits slightly above the ground. We also cut all the cages at the corners, at a 90-degree angle. That way once the corner rebars go in, they sit flush on both sides. Then we're welding rebar spacers at the top. These mark the foundation width and edge. Later on, the formwork will go right against these spacers. That'll keep it exactly where we need it, so there's no need for strings anymore. And finally, we tie all the corners and connecting rebars together with steel wire to keep the whole frame locked in place. All the rebar work is tied together and finished. This will work like one solid structure. Now we can move to the next stage, setting up the formwork to keep the concrete exactly where we want it. I almost forgot to mention these plastic caps. Before we started the formwork, we installed them on the ends of the spacers we welded earlier. They're there to protect the formwork panels, so they don't get scratched or damaged rubbing against the raw steel. And back to the formwork. We always start installing the formwork panels from the corners of the foundation. That way both corners line up perfectly in place. Then we hammer wooden pegs into the ground, locking the panels solid in place. Once the corners are in, we can put the rest of the panels in place. Before we can add more formwork panels, we need to sort out the front section of the garage entrance. To do that, we're laying EPS 100 insulation under the front part of the foundation. This section stays exposed. It's not going to be buried like the rest, so it needs extra protection from the cold. The EPS helps block frost and keeps the concrete from acting like a cold bridge. Now we can put the rest of the formwork panels in. At this point, we're only left with the custom cuts, the spots where standard sheets don't fit. For those, we're using a circular track saw to get precise. I almost forgot to mention, we oil up all the boards and panels before installing them. That way the concrete doesn't stick and it's a lot easier to strip the formwork later on. And once all the formwork boards are in place, we can start locking the whole setup together. We start by locking each wooden peg to the bottom of the formwork with threaded rods. Normally we just hammer the pegs straight into the ground and that would do the job. But since the site's pretty wet and the foundation's quite wide, we're playing it safe, using threaded rods for the bottom connection. For the top, we're using thick steel wire to tie the pegs together from both sides. And we're using wooden spacers, so we don't over-tighten the top. Once everything's locked in, we'll take them out. The formwork's really coming along now. Everything's lined up nicely and locked together tight, and we've got just a few more steps left before we can start the pour. One of the next steps is going all around the formwork and marking the finished height directly on the boards. To do that, we're using the optical level and nails as markers. And for the last step, we're installing 2 rows of vertical rebars every 60 centimeters all around the foundation. These rebars are here so once the foundation sets, they'll tie the hollow concrete blocks to the foundation, because from the foundation up, the walls will be going up with these hollow blocks. Once we finish this last step, we can finally pour the concrete. We've got 10 cubic meters for this foundation. Let's hope we didn't leave any weak spots in there. The pour is coming along sweet. Everything's holding together nicely. Once we're done, we'll let the pump truck go and start leveling the top. We're using a finishing trowel to level out the top. We're checking the nails as reference points. They show us exactly where the concrete height needs to be. Then we spread the concrete evenly from one nail to the next. And for a bit smoother finish, we're using a putty knife, just placing it gently on the concrete and dragging it across the top to smooth out any small lumps. And just like that, the concrete's in and finished. We'll let it dry for a few days before stripping the formwork and moving on to the next tasks on this foundation. Came out sweet. No honeycombing, solid all the way through. The surface looks clean and all the edges held perfectly. Now we can move on to installing the overflow pipes inside the foundation. First, we're setting up the whole pipe system on the ground, marking exactly where each overflow outlet will be. We're adding one pipe for each room, just enough to handle any water if something ever leaks inside the basement. And once the whole system's in place, we mark out where we need to dig the trenches for these pipes. And off we go with the digging. We're shaping the slope right into the ground, giving the pipes a solid base that runs toward the outside drainage. That way the slope stays firm and we'll have less work later on. When the digger was digging out the hole for this basement, it made it look easy. Now I'm here digging this trench by hand in hard clay, and it's definitely not as fun as it looked with the digger. But we made it. The trench is fully dug out. Now we can bring in the sand for the bottom layer. This sand gives the pipes a soft, even bed to sit on. It protects them from sharp stones and keeps them supported evenly along the whole length. Then we double check that the sand layer still follows the slope, leading out toward the outside. And we can finally chuck this system into the trench and cover it all with sand. We're using sand instead of clay because it protects the pipes. Clay can press and shift over time, especially when it gets wet. Then we compact the sand around the sides of the pipe using the handle of the shovel. That helps lock the pipe in place and makes sure it won't shift when the rest of the sand goes in. And just like that, the overflow system for the inside of the basement is installed. Now we can move on and start sorting out the outside of the foundations. After a huge storm, a lot of clay had fallen back in from the sides. So first we need to clear all that out before working on the outside of the foundations. We brought in another excavator, a smaller 7-ton one, to help us clear out all that clay. After that, we start digging a trench around the outside for the drainage pipe. It'll sit about 20 centimeters deeper than the foundation at the highest point, with a steady slope leading toward the front. That way water can drain out naturally without any buildup. We couldn't get all the way around the foundations with the excavator, so we're finishing the rest with the shovel, and at the same time smoothing out the slope. Then we double check that we're at the right depth, and that the slope is going in the right direction all the way through. Once everything's confirmed, we lay a thin layer of sharp sand at the bottom of the trench. We don't want the drainage pipe sitting in this nasty mud. Before we install the drainage, we need to waterproof the outside of the foundations. First, we clean off all the mud from the concrete. Then we fill up the holes left from the formwork. We let the concrete dry a bit, and then we can start waterproofing. We're using a black bitumen waterproofing coating. It's a thick, tar-like paint made to seal the concrete. We're putting on a thin first layer, making sure there are no gaps left uncovered. Once that dries, we come back and apply the second coat. And for the third layer, we're installing a dimpled membrane. It protects the waterproof coating and lets the water drain down to the bottom, where the pipe collects it. Now that the waterproofing's done, we can move on to installing the drainage pipe. Since we prepped everything before, this one's going to be an easy job. We just need to double check the pipes going on a slight slope, so the water flows to the outlet. And then we connect both sides of the pipe to the overflow system that's coming from inside the basement. And that is it. The pipe is ready to be buried. We're burying the pipe with pure sand. It protects it and lets the water drain through easily. Yeah, gravel on top would be better, but we decided to keep it simple this time. And that's how this basement foundation came together. Solid, waterproof, and ready for what's next. More builds on the way, so hit subscribe, drop a like, and let me know what you think in the comments.